Thank you, Senator, and I want to start off by thanking you for the hard work, and I'm glad that you took a moment to point out what the process has been. You've spent a lot of time, and I think everybody is appreciative of that kind of time, so thank you for doing what you've done.
Thank you, Senator Watson.
And I do believe session after session, particularly as you have chaired the administration committee, you have dedicated yourself to making sure that the Senate runs well, and that's greatly appreciated. I'm going to start with Section 5 of the resolution, and I want to start with the concept of what you have generically referred to, and I think we all generically refer to as the 2/3 rule. And I want to ask a couple of questions about that, because when we refer to the 2/3 rule, as you did in your outline, correct me if I'm wrong, but what we're referring to there is the requirement that is located in Rule 5.13. 5.13 is suspension of the regular order of business. It's a calendaring, if you will. And Rule 5.13 says that no bill, joint resolution, or resolution affecting state policy may be considered out of the regular calendar order unless the regular order is suspended by a vote of 2/3 of the members present. That is the 2/3 rule that generally is talked about when we talk about the 2/3 rule in the Senate. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And how long has that practice or tradition, and part of what we do is we file in the Senate what's referred to as a blocker bill. The lieutenant governor will refer that to committee. It gets voted out of committee and gets on the calendar quickly, and that becomes the bill that every bill behind that has to have currently a 2/3 vote in order to make it to the floor.
If you're going to take something out of order, correct.
That's right. So how long has that practice and tradition been in place?
Well, Senator, I can only speak to my time in the Texas Senate. That's what I'll speak to. And it's been in place since I've been here. But since I've been here, we've gone around that rule on several occasions.
Well, and I want to ask about that a little bit. There are, as we indicate that we're talking about making a change in the rule, there are ways that have been utilized to get bills to the floor that otherwise might have been blocked by a third of the members present, and that's what you're saying.
I believe that's what I was saying.
Through special order or it being brought up in a special session. And the rules even allow for a mechanism to have a special order to get around situations where someone believes that they've been unnecessarily or unfairly blocked on a bill making it to the floor.
There are all kind of things you can do throughout these rules.
And some of them are far more of a scalpel approach than a more of a axe approach to changing that rule so that bills can make it to the floor. Things like a special order, which we had on redistricting and voter ID, and allowed those bills to make it to the floor.
Is that a question?
It is. You've seen that happen, haven't you?
I've seen all kind of ways to maneuver around the 2/3 rule. That's why I think we need better rules so we're not constantly looking for ways around the 2/3 rule.
Well, let me ask it this way then. Since you have publicly stated that you believe the 2/3 rule has been good for bringing about consensus, causing additional deliberation, those sorts of things, if you're trying to solve a problem of a handful of bills that can't make it to the floor, wouldn't it be better to use the scalpel approach than to just have a blanket change in the 2/3 rule, which does bring about such deliberation and consensus?
No, I think you want consistency throughout the rules. And so that's why we've taken the blanket approach.
Now, you indicated that part of the reason this is being brought forward now is that members and the president have campaigned on the issue of changing 5.13, the so-called 2/3 rule.
Well, I don't know if they went out on the campaign trail and talked about 513.
They talked about what we've identified as the two-thirds
exactly.
rule.
The two-thirds rule has become a campaign subject in Republican primaries. There is no doubt about that.
Would you agree with me, Chairman Eltife, that whatever we do in our rules, one of the things we should do is protect against efforts that weaken transparency on behalf of the public, being able to see what it is we're doing, public notice, and the ability for senators to know what it is that they're voting on?
I'm all about transparency, and I think that's why you've seen members thank me for this process.
I think you've had
because it has been a very open process.
But the point being, my question is, would you agree with me that we shouldn't weaken the ability to have openness and transparency or members to know what it is they're voting on unless we've got, and we shouldn't do away with protections or make it easier to abandon protections without a good reason?
Well, that's a blanket statement. Give me a specific and I'll answer it. I mean,
okay, well, let me give you one.
We all want transparency. It's such a buzzword out there that we all get in front of a TV camera and say, I'm for transparency. I want you to see everything government's doing. So we're all for transparency.
Well, let's talk about a couple then. Because when we talk about the two-thirds rule and we look at the resolution, we've identified what the so-called two-thirds rule is. But what this resolution does is it changes, I think, everywhere our rules say two-thirds of the members present, it changes that to three-fifths. Is that correct?
I think if you look through the, I don't know every place, but I believe almost every place.
Okay.
Look through we have a flow chart for you.
Actually, you have what appears to be a side-by-side.
There you go.
All right, well, let's talk about side-by-sides for a minute. One of the places that the rule gets changed is Senate Rule 12.10, which is a section-by-section analysis of conference committee reports. Do you agree that our rule currently says essentially that no conference committee report can be adopted without a section-by-section breakdown that compares the House version and the Senate version and clearly specifies which version the conference committee adopted?
Yes.
That's our current rule.
Okay.
And what we're doing with this proposed resolution is we would be changing so that it would be easier to abandon that rule by dropping it from two-thirds requirement to set aside that rule to a three-fifths requirement.
So you think requiring 19 members to approve that rule versus 21 makes it less transparent?
What I'm suggesting is there's a purpose for that rule, which is to make sure that all of the members can make a comparison, much like what you've provided us here. And we are now being offered the opportunity to weaken the protection by reducing the number of people it takes to abandon that protection.
I just don't view it that way. I think 19 members, a supermajority of the Senate, is ample number of members for that rule. I think that's fine. Well, and I don't think that weakens or lessens the transparency.
Do you know of anyone that campaigned on doing away with the two-thirds requirement for a layout of section-by-section analysis on conference committee reports?
Well, let me put it this way, Senator Watson. People campaign on ideas, and they're elected to lead, and then they're sent to represent the 700,000 people their constituents. And I can tell you this, that there's real concern in the Republican primary voters about the fact that our supermajority is now 21. I wasn't on the ballot, but I know the members that I've spoken to that were on the ballot, it's been an issue with their voters. So I don't think the voters read the rule book. And furthermore, the rules are actually for the members of this Senate to govern ourselves in how we operate. So I think those voters picked the person with the ideas that they believed in and sent them to the Texas Senate. And my observation is, in the Republican primaries, this was an issue.
Well, let me ask if this was then. Let's talk about something specific to the voters.
All right.
One of the things that your resolution would do is it would change Senate Rule 22.01, which is the so-called, what I call anyway,
Catch-all.
The catch-all,
Correct.
default rule.
That's right.
And what that says is that if a rule doesn't otherwise specify what's necessary to set it aside,
Correct.
it takes 2/3.
Correct.
Now, we have a side-by-side here, but this side-by-side doesn't include those rules that would fall in the catch-all.
That's correct.
So, for example, Rule 11.10. That is a rule regarding public notice of a committee meeting. This would say it no longer takes 21, it takes instead a lesser number to abandon that rule regarding public notice of committee meetings. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Rule 11.18 is the rule regarding the requirement for a public hearing. This resolution would make it easier because it would take a lesser number of votes to abandon the rule related to the requirement of a public hearing if we pass this resolution. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Rule 7.09 requires a fiscal analysis or a fiscal note to accompany a bill so that we know the impact that the bill has on our Senate budget. The resolution we have in front of us would make it easier to abandon that requirement by reducing the number of senators it would take to suspend that rule.
Any rule that is not specified in the rule book comes under the catch-all. So it will go from 21 to 19.
And I understand that, but I think it's important for us to point that out since it's not part of the side-by-side and it falls into a catch-up. And because I do think that the public is watching.
I hope they are.
And I do think that several, frankly, the new members that you referred to in your opening comment, we've got 8 new members that one of their very first votes will be to reduce the requirement necessary to abandon the rule on public notice of committee meetings, the requirement for a public hearing, the requirement for a fiscal note, and, for that matter, the rule that bars lobbyists from the floor, or how we deal with a senator who accepts a bribe. And I think it's important for people to know that that is in this, because when we talk about just the 2/3 rule, that's a very specific thing. But we're now taking this to changing the way we vote on transparency and openness in government. You won't deny, will you, that it will be easier to throw out a rule that's intended to add openness and transparency
I do not,
at 19 as 21.
I do not believe that this is going from 21 votes to 19 is less transparent. The fact of the matter is, Senator Watson, most of my constituents think it's a majority rule in the Texas Senate. They think 16 people can do whatever they want. So now we're going from 21 to 19. I don't think dropping it from 21 to 19 is one iota less transparent. I do not believe that.
Making it easier to abandon a rule that requires transparency can in fact lead to less transparency. And there ought to be a burden that if you're going to change the rules to make it easier to abandon transparency and things of that nature, there ought to be a good reason for it other than just the idea that I don't think it'll be that big a difference. I do appreciate the time you spent on this, and I appreciate you answering my question.
Senator Watson, and I appreciate you. You had some great ideas, and some have been incorporated, and I appreciate you working with me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Watson.